The ANC has decided to form what is known now as the GNU, the Government of National Unity. Clearly, this must be a counter-revolution, if you like, because one wonders whether this type of government will be able to redress or rather address the imbalances and the injustices of the past.
Well, I think we need to make it clear that this isn't a government of national unity. There's no unity between the parties involved in this situation. So if we're going to be talking about a government of national unity, we really have to look at 1994 and what a government of national unity looks like and what it's supposed to do. And if we throw away the sort of pandering that the ANC is doing to their past to try and, recount on that Mandela fever and look at the government of national unity through a historical view, we'll understand that it's not a government of national unity. It's rather what some people are calling is a broad coalition of parties.
Would you say the ANC is counter-revolutionary given its presence in the political spectrum and now that it seeks to work with the likes of the DA and other right-wing political parties?
So the ANC has definitely had a number of splits from it. And one of the splits itself was the EFF. So they also had the split of MK. So I think when we look at which factions of the ANC have split off, we can see it's those factions which are more revolutionary. I think if we went back to 2009 or 2004 and said, is the ANC going to work with the DA, that wouldn't have been a possibility because the more revolutionary parts of the ANC were still in the party. So I think after these splits have happened, what we've seen is that the ANC has become, I suppose you could call it a force of counter-revolution.
You're a staunch proponent of open border, leaning towards the EFF's, open border policy or the EFF posture when it comes to the issues of immigration.
So my opinion in relation to the open border didn't really come from the EFF. So I have a lot of friends that work with, or a lot of colleagues that work with things like Abakhali Basam John Dolo, work with different communities in Limpopo. And from discussions with them and discussions with people that talk about issues of immigration, the sort of conversation or reality we've reached ended up being what was the most similar to the EFF. So we didn't take these sort of policies by saying, okay, the EFF is right, let's see what they say about immigration. What we said was, what would be right? And it just so happens that it seems that the EFF's policies on immigration approach more to what we collectively found as being correct. So it's sort of, I'm sure you understand it, it has to come down to the question of solving the root issues or the root causes of immigration. And what we realized was that majority of parties, besides the EFF, if they actually are able to implement it, would be one of the only parties to actually be able to solve the root cause of immigration.
Yeah, of course, today is a big day. We understand that the 7th administration, if you like, the 7th parliament kicks off its business of the day today with the election of the speaker and the president. What are your sentiments around this?
There's been talk by MK of not showing up in parliament. There's been a lot of disruption around this specific parliament seating. But I don't think they're going to go and form anything more than just electing the president. I think Ramaphosa is going to be re-elected. And I think we might be seeing the DA taking up more positions than we had originally expected. Possibly a position as Speaker of the House. This is a very different time for South Africa. This has never happened before. And history happens every day. And I think today we need to be cognizant that today is going to be a real turning point in the history of South Africa.
But is that, or will that be in the interest of the black majority or the poor and the marginalized?
Well, that's a question we need to look into of a longer conversation. But I don't see it happening at this point. Sure, the DA, I think, has dialed back a lot of their more, right-wing policies. The DA's not, the DA's policy framework isn't popular to the majority of people. They're only a 20% party, which means that 80% of people stand against the DA. So what the DA has done is that they might be able to address band-aid issues. Maybe if they solve some issues of cadre deployment, if they functionally run the government as they purport to do in Cape Town, they may solve, some of the government's issues within the ANC. But as they've done in Cape Town, they haven't resolved the fundamental issues of that affect the black masses of this country. So I think it's going to be much of the same. It's going to be a coalition of continuation where we see sort of the same policies of the ANC being approached, just now with the DA throwing in their own ideas, which I don't think are going to be applicable to most people.
Yeah. Thank you very much, the people of South Africa, Africa, and the world. My name is Titus Tungu, and we're coming to you from Winnie Madikizela Mandela House here in Johannesburg. And today we are joined by a political director from Sowevote, Ewan Dawkins. He joins me now in studio. Very good morning to you and welcome to the EFF podcast, Dawkins.
Good morning, Titus. Thank you so much for having me here.
So you and I have been speaking, and I'm glad that you have heeded the call from our loyal viewers of the EFF podcast who requested that you be part of this show, particularly because of your strong views. You hold strong views when it comes to the issues of immigration, and more often than not, the EFF is mostly misconstrued and its position misunderstood when it comes to the issues of border management and immigration. If perhaps you can just talk us through your position on the border issue.
So I think the reason I brought up the issue of immigration was what we were trying to do was answer the question of, what happened to the EFF in this election? Because we saw there was a marginal backtracking in votes, and that could have been attributed to the MK, or that could have been attributed to the issue of immigration. So when we look at the issue of immigration, I definitely think the EFF has been misconstrued. I don't think it's, completely just people not understanding the policy of the EFF. I think the EFF might have been able to work a bit better in explaining it outrightly. I've read the manifesto. It's a wonderful document, but the only place immigration is really mentioned is in progressive international affairs, and it doesn't really go exactly into what is supposed to be said. But I think, Dr. Ndlozi also went on and talked quite about immigration and tried to explain it. But I think the issue of immigration and illegal immigration is something that is being purposefully misconstrued in the South African context. And it's been purposefully misconstrued to keep those in power in charge, and to keep the utility of political xenophobia, vibrant in this country so that they can, keep those who have wealth and power in their seats. So when we look at the issue of immigration, the reason I bring up the issue of borders so often is that we have to firstly understand that, why are these people coming to South Africa in the first place? So when we look at the issue of why people are coming into South Africa, is that there's a national question, or should I say, African national question about immigration. So we know that a lot of these countries are suffering from issues of US imperialism. They're suffering from issues of, lack of democracy and so forth. And what the EFF plans to do, and that's why we really spoke about it, was that they're trying to address the main causes that are causing those people to come. So we have people like, Gayton McKenzie, who's like, we must just close the borders and stop them from coming. I think that's a very good policy on the part of the EFF to explain that just closing the borders isn't possible. And it's not possible both physically or fiscally. Because when we look at our borders, we know that the land border of South Africa is longer than the border of the US and Mexico. And that's a border that spans a continent. And with the amount of funding we have to actually police and control those borders, you understand it's a lot less than the United States. So when we look at these sort of issues of what we can actually do to prevent illegal immigration, like Gayton says, to build a wall or to put more police on those borders, we understand it's almost impossible. And, there's questions of, ethics, if it should be ethically right to deny Africans access to African countries. But if we do hold the point that we want to prevent immigration, we do hold the point that that would be beneficial, we know that their policies aren't going to work. Because when we have such a long border, when we have an inability and physical inability to police and protect that border, we're not going to have a reduction in immigration. But secondly, what we have to look at is why these immigrants are not coming legally. And we understand that's an issue with documentation. The ANC went and gazetted another green paper to make legal immigration easier, but it hasn't been effective and so forth. And I think what the EFF's policy when it comes to creating an African passport really looks like the best measurement. So when we have Zimbabweans coming illegally to South Africa, they have to get and have to pay for a 3,000 Rand passport. That's a lot of money for anyone, especially people coming from rural areas, which are the main people coming to South Africa. And what we have to understand is if we want to actually track these people, if we want to prevent crime in South Africa, if we want to have databases where all of these people are on, we have to let them in and we have to have a border management control that allows people to come in legally instead of illegally. And what does this look like? This looks like having a border management that control where legal immigration is easier than illegal immigration. And that allows these sort of issues that Gayton brings up about people illegally working on, white farms for less than minimum wage, issues of crime in South Africa that illegal foreigners are allegedly committing, is to have these people on South African police databases and then being able to manage them like we manage any other types of crime. So when the EFF says, okay, what we're going to do is have an African passport or that functions similar to a European, card visa system where you can go between countries a lot more easily. We're not going to have people going through these borders illegally, paying a lot of money for people to put people through the borders, to smuggle them. Rather, you'll just have people going to the border, using their united sort of passport system, going through the borders legally, and then having a DNA database and having a fingerprint database. And that allows these police to track these people a lot easier. And that's really the benefit of the EFF's immigration policy, because it firstly understands that these people are going to come anyway, let's do it right, where the rest of the parties refuse to admit that it's not really possible to prevent it. And then it goes back to the first point that I brought up about why these people are coming. So the EFF, from what we've analyzed, is that they look at the root causes of this question. And that's the root causes of addressing the economic issues within Zimbabwe, looking at addressing the issues in Northwest Africa, Western Africa, looking at addressing the issues in Congo. And that looks at developing value addition chains between these continents, setting up systems where free trade can be a lot more easier, where local exports within South Africa and our manufacturing industry in this country can be, increased by exporting and moving trade between all of these African countries. And what this looks like is that these countries are going to grow, their economies are going to grow. And specifically when it comes relation to government, we're going to have a lot more democratic forms of government within these countries. And therefore, we're going to see these countries getting better. What that means is that we're not going to have illegal immigration coming to South Africa. By readdressing the sort of structural and global inequalities that affect the African continent as a whole, we'll be able to position South Africa in a way where we have a role to play that really affects and protects and helps the continent evolve to a point where immigration isn't going to happen.
And I strongly believe that this must be understood within the context of imperialism, because we must also understand the agenda of countries like the US. You pointed out the US and the Mexico border. Joe Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump, is the one who was advocating for a wall to be built between the US and the Mexico boundaries or border, right? But now, the EFF stands firmly, by the way, in its position, because the border issue is very sensitive in the sense that it is the agenda of the right-wing establishment. If you like, it is the remnants of colonialism and apartheid.
Sure.
And the EFF stands to redress those injustices of the past. And the EFF is not in any way advocating for illegal immigrants. We are just calling for one Africa, one currency for the purposes of an integration, a continent where there's free trade. We're able to, do business with, all the African countries, which to the enemy, it's not good news. That's not what the enemy, or that's not what imperialists want. What they want is to divide and rule,
conquer.
right? So now the EFF is very much strong on the issues of saying, let's have a united Africa. Do you think now, in the elections of 2024, that may have costed the EFF? Do you think the people, didn't give the EFF the vote it deserves on the basis of its policies? Do you think that is anything to go by?
Well, you see, I think the EFF has a national appeal. Anywhere in this country where there's an issue of racial injustice, where there's an issue of, workers' injustice in the country, it's always the EFF is the first people a lot of people call. When there's children in schools getting abused by racists, the EFF is there. So I think the EFF does have a national appeal, and they have a very big utility to the majority of South Africans, just as an organizational force that helps the working class and Black people and Africans in particular. But I think there is a question to be asked about, ultra-leftism in the EFF and the issue of illegal immigration. Because if we look at, Limpopo, for example, we understand that the ANC still won a 70% majority in Limpopo. And the EFF didn't end up getting a lot of growth in that province. And what a lot of the discussions were about was that there might be an issue where, a lot of these people are affected by illegal immigration. The EFF hasn't done enough to directly address it and question it. A lot of white farmers will employ, foreign workers, or even in the US, for example, they employ, workers on a rotational period where they employ foreign workers to come and work in the country for a certain period of time. They don't have to pay them minimum wage, and then they leave the country. And the issue that a lot of people have seen in Limpopo is that this has been a problem with our farmers. And this might have, especially within Limpopo, for example, cost the EFF votes. But I think there's, a grand narrative of xenophobia in this country, which is unfortunate. But I don't think that grand narrative exists because of nothing. There's definitely, bourgeois propaganda that fuels it. There's a lot of hatred for fellow African people, which you can talk about Black consciousness and so forth. But I think there are realistic questions and realistic issues that South Africans face that unemployment, that illegal immigration contributes to, which is a real issue. And I think if the EFF spent more time directly addressing and questioning that issue of illegal immigration before the election and clearly explaining their policy, then they might have done, substantially better in this election. It might have cost them quite a bit, because the framing of it was that the EFF comes to power, we're just going to have the entire continent of Africa flooding our borders, no one's going to have jobs, which isn't true. Based on EFF policy. When we speak about open borders, or when the EFF speaks about open borders, it's not saying, hey, we're just going to destroy the borders, let anyone come in. It's a very specific, calculated policy approach to borders. And I think if the EFF spent more time laboring on that position, they might have, done better in this election.
And you are from Sowevote. You have been calling and urging the people, especially the youth, to vote, to participate in the 2024 elections. With your assessment and observations, do you believe that the youth turnout was satisfactory and the youth really, made their fair contributions?
I would say as a allegorical or from what I personally saw, I saw a lot of youth. Every voting station I went to, everywhere I went to look, when we handed out, coffee, when those lines were extremely long, late into the night, we saw a lot of young people standing and waiting to cast their ballots. But if we look at statistically what the elections looked like, there were a lot of people who were registered and then just didn't vote. And I think what we're seeing is that a lot of those people were young people. And there's a possibility that those young people who are more progressive would have turned to organizations like the EFF or away from, historical organizations like the ANC. But I don't think we saw as much of a youth participation as we may have, wanted to see. And I think that might have looked or might have been caused by, what people call is a disenfranchisement of voters. Voters aren't interested in politics. They're not interested in going out and voting and changing their lives. which is a really interesting question, because it's young people who are most affected by this. It's young people who are affected by youth unemployment.
Yes.
So it is a weird situation where there could be a variety of issues leading to the youth not being as involved in politics as they should be. But I think that just, owes to the culture of politics in South Africa and the discourse of politics in South Africa, that a lot of young people aren't as invited into seeing what politics is and what politics could be for them. They're rather focused on having a grind set and making money themselves and building a reputation somewhere. But I think parties, especially parties like the EFF, have to work hard to really tell the youth and engage with the youth to engage in politics a lot more. You see, what we did with Sowevote, which intentionally is supposed to look like Soweto, because we take our history from 1967, or from the Soweto uprising, when we said it was the youth that were the turning point in our country back then. And it's hopefully the youth that's going to be the turning point today. And what we did was, when we looked at the manifestos, went through all the manifestos, broke them down easily to understand, for young people to understand. We used memes and all those sort of devices to get young people involved. And what we wanted to see was more parties following through that sort of approach to get young people to understand the actual policies of the parties, instead of just focusing on razzmatazz and so forth.
What is likely to happen going forward for the next, 5 years? I mean, there's now so much appetite. A lot of people are interested in knowing what is going to happen from now going forward. And now we understand that the ANC has already, there are talks that the ANC will form a GNU, a government of national unity. Will that type of government, yield the positive results? Will it steer the country towards the direction where the poor and the marginalized will be, represented in terms of their interest?
Well, I think we really need to be careful about what we call it, because a lot of media hype wants to go and jump on the word GNU, but I don't think it's a government of national unity. We have to be very specific about the words we use and what sort of legitimacy we give to the ANC when we decide to take on their language, because this isn't a government of national unity. This is what I think has happened. I think the ANC understands that going into coalition with the DA is a very unpopular thing for them to do. And it's very unpopular with the ANC, within the ANC itself. We've seen, quite a number of splits from the ANC. And I don't think they could stand another one. After the EFF left, after MK left, what is really left of the ANC? If we see another split, maybe there'll be, a 10% party. So what the ANC has done, I think, is very clever. To say, hey, we're going to form a government of national unity. We bring up the, ideas and memories of 1994, of Mandela fever, of creating unity in this country. Because in that way, they don't have to go and say, hey, we're either going to work with the DA or we're going to work with the EFF or MK or so forth. What the ANC's done with this, GNU is to say, hey, we're open to work with anybody, come and approach us. So they've moved the position of forming coalitions away from themselves and put it on these other parties. So when people go and complain, hey, you're working with the DA, the ANC has an ability to say, hey, no, we're not working with the DA. We're open to work with anyone. Anyone can come in. But there's obviously a dichotomy between EFF and MK bloc, if you would like to call it, and the DA, Vryheidsfront Plus and so forth bloc. So the ANC, I think, understood that there would never really be a government of national unity because either or, we're leaving out one major section of the population. When we have a government of national unity, like we had in 1994, it's supposed to be a government where the largest amount of voters are represented, so that there's legitimacy, where you can't have, a very strong opposition. And what this looks like back then was that any parties with over 10% joined the government of national unity. The ANC sat at 60%, and about 90% of the voters were represented in that GNU. What we have now is that the ANC is not doing this out of the goodness of their heart or out of aim for national unity like they did in 1994. The ANC's lost, and they've actually fallen below 40%. I think it was 39.7%. They're doing it out of necessity. And And what this means is that they're trying to sort of portray themselves as a government of national unity without the national unity. Because either way you look at it, if they go into coalition with the DA, you're going to have 20, 30% of the voters unrepresented. If they go into coalition with the ANC and MK, they're going to have 20, 30% of voters unrepresented in parliament. So I think it's just illegitimate to call it a government of national unity. It's a sort of a coalition plus government. It's let's go with the DA, let's pretend we're not going with the DA, and let's throw a few small parties in there.
So this is precisely a smokescreen to bring in the DA and other right-wing political parties through the back door under the disguise of GNU.
I don't think it was specifically to bring in right-wing parties. It could have been the EFF and MK where they left the DA out, and it would have been the sort of same situation. But with the government of Ramaphosa and all of that, I think it is sort of a smokescreen to say, hey, we're not working with the DA. We're still got that sort of liberation heritage. Just stick with us. We'll be fine. We're just going to have a grand national coalition. Ramaphosa will be branded as the new Mandela. It's not actually selling out to, the right wing. But I think we need to be very careful, because if we look at the people now who are celebrating the DA-ANC coalition, which it should be called the continuation coalition, it was the same people who were talking about the new dawn. So, when Ramaphosa came into power, everyone was a certain group of people, representing the markets were very excited that this was a capitalist president who was a business guy. The markets increased, the rand improved for a little while, but it didn't actually end out well. I think we've seen a much worse time than we did before the so-called new dawn was declared.
Sure.
So we need to be careful of who's calling this a good time.
So in a true sense of GNU, if it takes shape, what would you expect it to be like, as opposed to the way it is now? You are saying it is not actually GNU. In the true sense of GNU, what would be expected to happen or to unfold?
It's an interesting question, really, because what we're going to see is, probably, or what we may see tonight actually, is Ramaphosa being re-elected, and certain positions being given to the DA, and maybe the Patriotic Alliance gets the Ministry of Policing or Home Affairs, and I think it's going to be sort of a continuation of the same thing. Maybe we're going to get a more stable government because we're going to have a 60%, possibly plus majority in Parliament. But what does stability actually mean for the vast majority of people? Does it mean systemic change for those who are landless? Does it mean actual economic change for those who are disenfranchised in society? I don't think so. Maybe the DA is good at governing Cape Town. Maybe they can deliver municipal services. But those services that ability to deliver services doesn't translate into national government directly. The DA hasn't been able to solve the vast inequalities that existed in the Western Cape for the last 30 years, that existed under apartheid. And in some cases, it's gotten worse. So we might be seeing the same thing. But I think the DA has been very strategic in this. They haven't been saying we're going to take out our biggest policies. We're going to look at the policies that are the most similar to the ANC and vie for those. But I think what the DA is planning to do is really look at the issue of privatization. And the issue of privatization, I think we can agree, is a worrying issue because we know the examples of how privatization works on a national level. What I often bring up is the example of Russia in the 1990s. We don't even have to stop with like the worst case scenarios, even the best case scenarios under Margaret Thatcher, where she had popular support, where she privatized the Thames water companies and she privatized the railways. What we understand is that when we have this mass privatization, we're not ending up with a competitive market of small private companies. So what this looks like isn't to say that, hey, when we privatize Eskom, we're going to have a number of people buying up shares in Eskom, starting up IPPs, all competing and contributing to get the lowest prices for the consumers. Rather, what we're going to have, and what's historically been proven as an example, you can check anywhere where national privatization has occurred, even now in Argentina, which is having an economic disaster, is that when privatization on this scale occurs, there's only a few sections of society that can actually afford to buy up these industries. So you have I suppose Patrice Motsepe starting his own IPP and maybe one or two other well-known billionaires in this country. And that doesn't mean that there's actually a competitive market. That doesn't mean that these companies are going to compete, drive down prices, give consumers, cheap electricity. What this rather means is that they're going to deliver profit to their shareholders, as what a private company is supposed to do.
Yeah.
So, they're pushing, the DA is very much pushing for, mass privatization of our state-owned industries. But it's very dangerous for those who are already impoverished, those who can't afford electricity already, those who don't have access to electricity in rural areas, in underdeveloped areas. So it's possibly going to lead to worsening conditions for the poorest in society. So maybe we can look at what does a good DA-ANC coalition look like, if such a world exists. It would look like a stronger EFF in opposition, a stronger MK in opposition, to stand up and say, hey, is the DA going to support or stand with the ANC with Phala Phala? So we know that when Parliament reconfigures and we're going to have a ANC-DA coalition, or if we have an ANC-DA coalition, there's going to be the issue of Phala Phala brought up. And we know the EFF was the party that led to the Constitutional Court, the parliamentary inquiry into Phala Phala. So what we're going to see is the DA either is going to have to work with the ANC and delegitimize itself as a party by saying we're going to vote against an investigation into Phala Phala in Parliament, or the DA is going to go and throw the ANC out and therefore have a weakened government and a weakened stake in the ANC. So it doesn't look like a good time for the DA and ANC coalition anyway. It does look like a good time for opposition parties like the EFF and possibly MK when they go to Parliament. Yeah.
Because in a nutshell, the ANC and the DA is just this, they are using this as some form of convenience and for mere, position mongering. If you look at it, the DA has always been calling for the Ramaphosa to step down amid Phala Phala, but now they are in bed together because of political convenience. Now the question is, whose interest is the so-called GNU going to serve? Because the two political parties seem not to be interested in the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat or the poorest.
Proletariat, yes.
The proletariat, right? Now, with the EFF and the MK obviously rejecting this some sort of a coalition between the ANC and the DA and vehemently saying that we're not going to form part of this type of government because it does not represent the interest of the people of South Africa, because the DA is not anywhere closer understanding the issues of land expropriation without the compensation, the issue that, the means of production must belong to the hands of the people, not to the selected few or the private sector. Now, if we allow the two to go ahead, this type of coalition government, will it last? And what would be the long-term ramifications of this type of arrangement?
Well, I think if we look at historical examples, in 1994, the GNU only lasted 2 years. The NP left because of political disagreements. We might see the same thing. And we're going to see a lot of controversy, especially with Phala Phala. I think that might be its downfall if the EFF goes ahead with bringing that to Parliament, which I'm assuming you can tell me if they're going to do or not. But it's going to be a very difficult time in government. And I think it's going to be a very difficult time in South Africa for the majority of people, because the praise singers of this sort of coalition were the praise singers of Ramaphosa's New Dawn. And the outcome of Ramaphosa's New Dawn was worsening conditions for the majority of people, not benefits. And I think the DA needs to be very, very careful about implementing radical economic transformation or radical reconfiguring of policy, because it's broadly unpopular. If the EFF, if the DA goes and attacks minimum wage, they go and attack BEE, we're going to see not just political antagonism towards the government, it's going to be mass civil antagonism towards the government, because these are largely extremely popular policies. And if we see the DA standing strong and, defending these things, either we're going to see a split in the ANC, or we're going to see, mass action against the implementation of those policies. But what could be a good outcome of this? I think if we look at the positives that we could see maybe the DA holding cadre deployment more to account, holding BE tokenism or BE tokenism more to account, looking at addressing issues of tenderpreneurship and all of those sort of issues within the ANC to account, then we might be able to see a government that delivers services more correctly. But the problem with that is who they deliver services to and who they really work to support and help. So what we might see is, an improvement in the markets, maybe in the first 2 years, an improvement in certain, economic, sort of statistics. The markets back when Ramaphosa came into power had a field day. Everything was happy, everyone was good, and then reality struck, and as capitalism usually does, they became real issues within the markets. So I think there's certainly a possibility that we're going to have the same thing with the DA and the ANC coalition, where we're going to have maybe a short time where things function well, which is also very improbable. People are very impatient right now. If they don't show drastic changes within the first 100 days in office, I think there's going to be, a lot of civil unrest, a lot of civil unease, and a lot of political, infighting between the parties. And, the government at the moment, I don't think has, the ability to function the way it should be. And I don't know if 100 days is enough time to get it functioning correctly. Even with, an embarrassed and an embezzled ANC that's now a lot more humble and that might be a lot more willing to actually do what they're supposed to do. I don't know if the amount of rot we've had in state institutions will be solvable within that first 5 years, within that 100 days. But on top of that, you have to really look at the interests of who these parties serve. The DA, a lot of people complain to me. They say I'm a radical leftist that wants to, destroy the DA. And these are mostly white people that call me a traitor and whatnot. But these are just policies that we have to focus on. And they just so happen to be along racial lines because race and class in South Africa is almost, symmetrical. And we have to understand that DA policy and, possibly DA policy within a coalition with the ANC will be there to serve white people. And by that extent, it may be there to serve the interests of the bourgeoisie, white rich people, because there's no approach to solving the dramatic and radical inequalities in South Africa. There's no approach to looking at the land question, of the question of massive unemployment, of the question of, ownership over the means of production, how that relation of production actually affects South Africa. So, I think we saw with their scrapping of the what they refer to as the minimum wage, or the drawing back of the minimum wage. I had this conversation with Liam, who's one of the DA's youngest members in Parliament. And what he said is that, no, if we remove the minimum wage, we're going to have massive employment in young people, massive employment in anything. And there's, serious problems with their economic policy because they want to just bring, standard book liberal policies that they've learned in university and apply to South Africa without looking at its material conditions. The problem with that sort of idea about just abolishing the minimum wage to increase employment, is that what we have is, for example, let's say you work at Coca-Cola, you produce bottles of Coca-Cola. When you reduce the minimum wage that these companies have to pay their workers, there's not suddenly an increase in demand for Coca-Cola. So these companies aren't going to hire more people to go and work at Coca-Cola. Instead, what we're going to have is just these workers who are also the consumers within this economy getting paid less and therefore having less capital, having less money to be able to buy the same products that they're producing. And the problem that's going to result from this is that we're just going to have more and more people with less money being able to buy the same products that they're producing. And therefore, the tax base is going to reduce. unemployment's actually going to increase. So, yeah.
And basically, the EFF is gunning for nationalization of mines and banks and other strategic sectors of the economy. And that is the lifeblood, by the way, of the South African economy. And the DA and other right-wing political forces are not so interested in that. And those are the bread and butter issues that affect ordinary citizens of South Africa. And if you, in the context of this new form of government, so-called GNU, it looks like it's driving, an agenda of, to some extent, white supremacy, because not when you look at the policies, by the way, the ideological differences between the DA and the ANC, the EFF, the ANC on paper, it will talk about radical economic transformation. But when you look at the DA, it's completely a proponent of neoliberal policies. Now, where are we going as the country? Would you then say the voters perhaps didn't get enough political education to make informed decision, especially here we're talking about the black majority, because black people are a majority in this country, or in Africa, by the way. Would you say then the voters may have had a mishap in terms of their choice? Because now there's some sort of GNU or this type of government because of the voters. They have spoken, they have decided. What's your take on that?
I don't think we should call the voters stupid or uneducated or like they don't know what's going on. 80% of voters didn't choose the DA. 80% of voters chose to vote for majority black parties, as you would say. So I don't think it's right to just say, hey, these voters were, uneducated or they didn't really know. I think it was really deliberate. The DA never said they were going to go into coalition with the ANC. The ANC rejected lots of different coalition attempts. All of these parties were really, really quiet about what they would do after the election. So I think there was a deliberate, keeping quiet in relation to coalitions after the election by these parties. And that may have misinformed voters on who to vote for because they trusted these parties to do the right thing. I think a lot of ANC voters are going to be very surprised and possibly angered that their party, which has a history of liberation ideology, is going to work with what they would consider, the enemy. Party that, had its founding in apartheid, that, had the NP join it in 2004. So there's going to be, I think, I wouldn't say it's completely the voters' fault that this sort of thing has emerged, but voter education was lacking. I think if we look at especially rural areas like the Eastern Cape, there's a continuation of voting for the ANC in our province with the lowest HDI. And I think the reason that may have occurred was because not many other parties besides the ANC and their 100-year history has the ability to go into every single ward and every single community and go door to door and advocate for their policy. So it might just be an issue of parties needing time to grow in certain areas and develop and spread their ideas. Or it might be certain policies like the issue of immigration that might have put people off from voting for more progressive parties.
Of course, today, Parliament is expected to obviously constitute the first sitting of the National Assembly and the election of the President and the Speaker as well. Perhaps if we can just zoom into that, how is the process expected to unfold? We understand that this is the very first sitting, despite the MK having gone to court and the court saying, nope, this
sitting is going to happen.
Yeah, it's going to continue. But now, let's zoom into the implications. If this so-called government of national unity is constituted, and what is the likelihood? What is going to happen practically from the NA?
Well, I suppose tonight, firstly, they elect the Speaker of the House and then so forth and so on until they get to the President. And I think all of this has already been decided behind back doors. I'm sure the coalition agreements have already been drawn up. But, even in 2019, when the ANC had a majority, they hadn't already declared which ministers are going to take which positions within the executive by the 2-week margin. So I think what they're going to decide for tonight is just who the president is going to be, who the Speaker of the House is going to be, and focus on that solely. And then afterwards go in and deliberate about who's going to take different ministry positions. And I'm sure they've already made concessions and promises to different parties about who's going to take what.
Going forward, obviously considering the fact that these political parties hold different ideological, policies. Now, what is likely to happen? Will these political parties be able to, for example, implement their own manifestos, given obviously the obvious issues of variety or differences on approach when it comes to their ideologies?
Well, there's what the ANC has been calling, I think it's like it's sort of where they, I'm forgetting the term now, but it's where they put in a budget, you agree with the budget, and then you work out each topic going forward individually. There's a specific term for it. I think that's the sort of position that they're going to take. And I think what this might do is give parties like the DA or the parties going into coalition with the ANC maybe unjustified power or, radically too much power compared to what share of the vote they got, because they're really able to hold the ANC and the parliament hostage. If you say, hey, we want these sort of laws implemented, we want these sort of acts to go through parliament or these changes to occur, and the ANC says we want these acts and coalitions and sort of things to occur, the DA is very much able to say, hey, we're not going to vote with you, we're not going to support you, we're not going to let the government get anything done unless you also agree to our demands. And there could be a sort of situation where the parties hold each other at ransom at points to try and get things through. But it's going to be an interesting case. We know what the EFF and MK and the ANC look like, because back in 2009, we had the ANC, MK, and the EFF all under one banner. Okay. And we saw economic growth, we saw all of these different things. We haven't really seen a DA in national government. And the danger with that is we don't really know where they're going to go, how radical they're going to pursue certain policies, and whether or not this is going to lead to a very weakened ANC that is just going to be pulled around by the DA, or if it's going to lead to, I suppose, an ANC that's thinks it has one last try and wants to, continue with the sort of policies that it already has.
And you being white or a white person, right? A lot of people may say, this fellow is questionable. Are you for politics of the left or politics of the right? Because judging by your views ideologically, you are not antagonistic towards what the EFF stands for, because everyone who lives in South Africa understands the history of this country. It was conquered through imperialism and colonialism, right? And to the detriment of the downtrodden. So why have you chosen that path to sort of lean towards the politics of the left?
I think identity politics is an issue that not a lot of people want to speak about, but it's a real issue. When I go and discuss hyper-specific mechanisms about the DA implementing certain policies that are going to affect other things, white people hate me for it, because they're like, this is a traitor, this is a sellout to our white cause. Nothing I said was anti-white, but it's a logical connection that white people have, or maybe it is a logical connection that white people have to their wealth and their power in society, where they see any sort of attack on the DA or on specific policies they associate with being an attack on whiteness, which I don't think is true. So when the DA goes and says, hey, we're not a party of identity politics, we don't care about race, we need to move past racial politics, it's just not true. The DA's policy is very much centered on race, and you can see that by just having a discussion with any DA supporter. Any sort of attack or question about the DA really brings it back to race. And that's their main criticism of the EFF, that the EFF is going to drive white people to the sea and going to chase them out the country, which is just untrue. But white people, I think, have a sort of maybe a natural revulsion and hindrance to say, oh, I'm scared, because their entire ideology is related to about perpetuating their white supremacy, their economic position in society. And when anyone, even white, black, goes and questions their economic position within society, they get a fear of it. I don't think I'm on the left or I'm on the right. I think I'm a pragmatist. And I think most people in South Africa would consider themselves pragmatists. And I think it would be foolish to try and say what the pragmatic thing to do in South Africa is to perpetuate white dominance, because that's just not realistically feasible for the future of this country. And to say, hey, we must continue to perpetuate white power in this country, the centrality of capital, of land in the hands of white people, and allow the majority of people to continue to live in impoverished conditions, I think it's going to be very harmful, not only to the majority black population, but to white people as well. Something I was discussing with my friend the other day was that white people aren't free in South Africa. And it's an interesting question, that white people and their ideology of separation prevents them from actually actualizing their humanity within society. White people live in gated communities. They live constantly in fear. And they do so because they refuse to recognize white dominance within the economy of South Africa. So every time they go and open their gate, they check behind them, they're scared to walk in the street, they're scared to connect with people, because they refuse to understand that transitioning the wealth of society to the majority of people would set them free, rather than concentrating that wealth within themselves and perpetuating inequalities that perpetuate crime and inequality and so forth. And in saying that, a lot of white people aren't free to really experience and engage with the people that they're around. White people are only, in their certain areas, only hang around with other white people. They set up sort of systems where they go to restaurants which are, priced out certain people from going to those restaurants. White people perpetuate that dominance within themselves, within society, to keep them separated. And that's not really freedom, because they're keeping their humanity separated from the rest of humanity. And I think that what causes a lot of white guilt and angst within white society. So if white people were able to recognize, hey, this system isn't going to work, it is wrong. I think, at least some white people have given to the fact that apartheid was wrong. If they recognize that this current system isn't working and isn't going to survive, you can't have a racial, economic and social dominance, and possibly now a political dominance over society where people are oppressed and you are put up for any period of time until that system collapses and you get into trouble. And I think that's the fear of white people. They're scared of the EFF because they think, hey, we've been sitting on top for such a long time.
Sure.
We're terrified of the EFF because we know the EFF is going to do what we did to black people in South Africa. That's their fear. And I think once white people start realizing that, hey, this isn't the way things have to be, things can be different, they might start, engaging with humanity more objectively.
Yeah. And the white community, if you look at it, they enjoy this level of inequalities because in the main, they own means of production. They somehow try and influence the political party policies and all of that. And with the EFF, they are failing to infiltrate, the economic emancipation movement. But with other parties, you look at the DA, Action SA, Rise Mzansi, they have infiltrated, you can check, it's there, the writing is on the wall. If you look at the 2023-2024 party funding, the disclosure, you can see who's being funded heavily by the establishment, which shows that white people aren't interested. They are never ready to share power. They're not ready to share means of production because they know that's where equality will come about, So in the context of GNU and with the political parties that receive funds from families like the Oppenheimers, do you think this GNU is likely to benefit the minority and those who perhaps funded heavily to these political party campaigns?
No, I think it's very obvious that this is just a perpetuation of the status quo. This is what a friend of mine has called the continuation coalition. It's a coalition that's just continuing with the same sort of order, and maybe even a more radically right-wing order because of its association with the DA. Because what we've identified, or what we could say we've identified, is that the ANC largely, quote-unquote, sold out in 1994. The IFP was a party that was greatly funded by the Oppenheimers to act as a third force against, liberation movements, specifically the ANC in South Africa. And the DA has always been what's largely considered a white party. And if we look at each three of those parties, which are going to go into the GNU, we can understand that, hey, whose interests are they serving? And we can understand that logically their interests are serving the white ruling class in this country. So it is probably going to just be a perpetuation of the same things we've seen for the last 5 years. And the only, hope that we could get from that is that either they do sort things out and they do run things correctly, because you've got an embattled ANC that's more humble and willing to work properly, and you've got a sort of democracy where more parties are involved and can hold the ANC and DA accountable. Or we can see, I think, some of the greatest politicians in this country, Malema and Jacob Zuma, acting as opposition that can stir and hold these parties accountable. And I think that's going to set a very interesting precedent for the next 5 years leading up to the 2029 election, where we might see the ANC possibly falling to lower 30s, 20s, because of their so-called selling out to the DA. So it's going to be a very interesting look at who's going to come into power in 2029.
And as a matter of ideological, approach and position, the EFF has vehemently rejected to form part of the so-called GNU. On the basis that obviously the EFF calls for economic freedom for the poor and the marginalized, and the land question remains a top priority in our country. And the EFF is not ready to bend its principles, because of opportunism, because of positions, because of blue lights, nonsensical luxury, So what is your take on the EFF's posture that it is not going to join this overrated GNU?
I do have a lot of criticisms of the EFF, but I think their ideological consistency is at least something to look up to. They say we care about the issue of open borders. We care about the unity of the African continent. We're not going to go and be like the ANC and talk one way, act another way. The EFF sticks to what they say. And that's a positive within the EFF. They stick to their morality and their, cardinal pillars, even though we could say that some of the revolutionary spirit of the EFF might be dying down in their moving away from nationalization to rather just starting a state bank and so forth. But that is something I suppose we could say is positive about the EFF, that they've stuck to their guns and they've stuck to saying, hey, we're not going to work with right-wing parties that don't believe in the betterment of poor and working class and marginalized people. And that might give them, a really good footing in the 2029 election to go and critique everything that the national government of the GNU would be doing. Another question, which I was speaking to some people which are really scared about, is that they wish the EFF went with the national government because they wanted the EFF to act as sort of a chip in the national government to prevent, a complete, right-wing or white power onslaught. So when it comes to the issue of NASFAS, I was speaking to people at my university and they said, we wanted to see the EFF part of the NGU because we believed that the EFF, when they were in the NGU, would be able to prevent that sort of drawing back of NASFAS, turning it into a loan, all of those things. So it could really be seen as either way, as a positive instance or as a negative instance. Because as the EFF becomes an official opposition party and as MK becomes an official opposition party, that bloc can work to still hold the new national government or new national government of unity to account. So there might be some utility in that.
And obviously, with a political party like the EFF, you'll never find, a flip-flopping on the basis of principles. The EFF always sticks to its manifesto, its founding manifesto,
Do you
its
think
character.
that's always true? Because, one of the biggest criticisms of the commander-in-chief is that, he supported Jacob Zuma, then he was against Jacob Zuma, then he seems to be supporting it against. Where do you think those sort of criticisms come from?
Politics, in my understanding, it evolves and material conditions on the ground change.
Okay.
Right? So we cannot hold the commander-in-chief, or we may not reduce him to what people call him because he supported Jacob Zuma. At the time, he was still within the ANC. He was expelled. Would you still expect him to support somebody who has expelled him? Absolutely no. So now the question is the EFF going back on the land question, on the 7 cardinal pillars? No. We still stick to our guns. We are saying who wants to work with the EFF must first deal with the
7 cardinal
basic
pillars.
issues of, unemployment, the basic issues of land. So there's nowhere you can alter or you can pin the EFF down on the when it comes to its approach. Now, I'm more interested in knowing that as a young person who lives in South Africa, obviously you and I come from a different background, but when you look at the rate of unemployment and also people who are mostly affected, you look at the white minority. I can give an example. During political campaigns or rallies, I don't see white people attending those rallies. And it begs the question, where are these white people when black people are attending these rallies? These people surely are enjoying wherever they are because of the status quo. They are privileged, right? So you as a young white person, how do you think the status quo can be changed? Because now I think we're stuck for the next 5 years.
5 years, yeah.
And with this GNU, do you think the youth will ever be considered, the struggles that the youth go through, such as access to education, unemployment, let alone inequality for now?
That's a big question. Firstly, about the issue of white people never coming to those rallies. That's true. I think that's twofold. White people don't have that sort of liberation history where they formed, mass movements to oppose things. Because, when you're in power, what are you really, joining together to oppose? But I think white people do form a solid voting bloc. I think if we look at the racial statistics of who votes, majority of white people who are registered usually go out and vote. So they I think white people, they sit back, they don't really engage in politics on the same sort of way black parties would engage in politics, because they don't have the same sort of needs, the same sort of aims, the same sort of revolutionary, desire for change. When you're defending the status quo, you're not really, uniting together to go and fight for a status quo. So they just sit back, they fund different parties or aspects of, white power fund different parties, and then they influence and they engage in parties differently rather than, using mass collective numbers to influence politics. They use their massive wealth to influence politics. Then there comes to the question of where do I see youth in the next 5 years? That's a worrying question because I think the ANC will stick to its guns in saying that they're not going to adopt some of the more Thatcherite policies of the DA, some of the more, capitalistic policies of the DA, where they say we're going to remove the cap set on private on accommodation at universities. We're going to turn NSFAS into a loan. All of those things are really, really worrying to young people. And if they do come through, I think we're going to see mass civil action against that. But if the ANC is able to say, hey, this is going to, bite too much into our base in the next election, we're not going to go through that, then we might just see the continuation of the same sort of struggles we have now. I don't think there would be either any radical change to the way NSFAS and youth issues are responded to, or we might see a sort of backsliding because of hyper-specific economic policies being pushed through by these parties. So either it's going to be better, it's going to be the same, or it's going to be worse. That's my predicament. And that's not to say we should completely be pessimistic, but it doesn't seem like young people, have too much of anything to look forward to.
And by the way, in politics, there are no permanent friends,
There are
no permanent enemies.
Sure.
So when the CIC defended, or rather was, one of the people who were pro Jacob Zuma at the time, while in the ANC Youth League, that was at the time. But there was
you have to
no...
look at the material conditions.
Yes, and now when you look at there was a report, the Nkandla report, the Public Protector report. So the EFF and its leaders, the CIC in the main, he's one leader that stands for the poor. So there was no way he was going to defend someone who has allegedly stolen money from, from the public purse and whatnot. But now, as we wrap up this conversation, it will be very, very interesting for the next, few days and even beyond to understand how these political parties are going to work together. And do you think they will be able, when it comes to amending the Constitution, like Section 25 of the Constitution, in terms of, maybe looking at how to tighten the issues of crime, how to, when you look at the home affairs, how to manage the issues of immigration. These parties, do you think they will walk the talk, or it's merely and strictly about the hype about, positions?
Well, when, like I've mentioned previously, there was a lot of hype that Ramaphosa would do this in 2019. And obviously we didn't see that happening. I don't know if we could make a case that they will do anything or they won't do anything. I think maybe still it's a bit too early to tell exactly where they're going to stand. But it doesn't seem probable. And the reason I say it doesn't seem probable is because parties like the DA and IFP and so forth, they're not advocating for changes to the Constitution. They want to keep things as they are. And when you have coalitions of, the status quo, you're not looking at radical changes or addresses to the Constitution or to the fabric of society. You're looking for the continuation of, blanket service level problems, service level issues. But I don't really see any too radical change coming from this. I think it's going to be largely the same as what we saw under Ramaphosa, maybe just to a friendlier market extent, which is also questionable because, benefit to the market doesn't necessarily mean benefit to the South African people. A stable market doesn't mean stability in the households of those who are downtrodden and those who are poor. But I suppose there comes a little bit of white ignorance when it comes to the DA. And the reason I say this is because a lot of the policies and people that the DA are putting through, especially looking at their shadow ministers of energy, are very pompous, are very, we can do everything, because, we did it before, quote unquote. And I don't think the DA is ready for how much of a challenge national government actually is to run. And it's going to be a very interesting thing to see. But I think there is some cause for concern and some fear that is genuine and justified in the population.
Yeah. So you don't see the ANC changing its mind, perhaps forming a coalition with the MK party and the EFF?
If the national government of unity fails, there's definitely all sorts of policies and things up in the air. Maybe Ramaphosa will be kicked out tomorrow. We don't know. Every day in South African politics is like a month at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think after the first 100 days, we're going to see how the government of national unity, quote unquote, is going to function. And we're going to definitely see a really, really big effect of Phala on whether or not we can trust the DA to still hold the ANC accountable in its current form. And if that sort of national government fails and derolls and we could possibly see the EFF going into coalition with the ANC, or we could see the MK going to coalition with the ANC, which is still less likely. But there's also the possibility of just splitting up provincial powers, where you could say, hey, we'll give MK, KZN, we'll give Gauteng to the EFF and see how they manage to run Gauteng. And then at the national level, we'll have the DA. So there's a number of different ways you could organize this splitting or delineation of powers. But I don't see at the moment, I don't see that as a possibility, because Ramaphosa is also a very tight person with the private sector, with the markets, and the EFF is broadly seen as antagonistic to that. The so-called doomsday coalition, which I just think is hogwash. But I don't see any time now them going into coalition with the EFF. Do you see it differently?
Nah, not at all.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
So tell me, where were you born, my brother? Where are you from?
I was born in Joburg.
Okay, just here in Joburg.
Just here. We could probably walk to the hospital I was born at.
Okay, let's do that after the show. Sure. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, just talk to me about your background.
Okay, sure.
What kind of family have you grew up from, and now with your political views or stance, how is it received?
Oh, okay. It's always a funny thing to talk about class when it comes to race, because if I were to say, if I was around my white friends, they'd consider me very low class, poor, middle class, because that's the sort of eye that they look in. But when I have my friend that lives in Alexandria, he definitely thinks, oh, I'm very upper class. So the delineations between race and class in South Africa is a very interesting question to look at. But I was born in Kensington, and that's where I spent most of my life. I went to a public primary school, public high school, and my politics sort of devolved out of a lot of my teachers. So I had, Mr. Chinogray, Mr. Dube. These are people you don't know, but maybe I think his name is Sizwe Mpofu Walsh.
Yes,
he's also been one of my lecturers and one of my adverts.
Okay.
And it's just been a collection of these different individuals who have helped teach me and shape me into my political, leanings and ideology. I think a lot of the time, people like to say, hey, young people are idealistic, and if you're young and you don't have heart, you're not really a person. But when you get older, you'll become more conservative, you'll become more less radical, or so forth. But I don't think that's the case we're seeing, because if we look at why young people get more radical, it's because their position in class and in power increases over time. In the US, 50 years ago, you'd be a young person, you could buy a house, you could buy, all of these different amenities that would benefit you. But today, those sort of same things aren't possible. So I think the relation between young people staying disenfranchised in society, even into their old age, is going to continue people being radical. My personal, I think, tipping point when I started engaging in politics happened in about 2016, 2015.
In the build-up to the local government elections?
Oh, it was in relation to the build-up in the local government elections. I can talk about my history in politics. But what sort of catalyzed it was, I think what catalyzes most people into politics is, seeing things that, change you. So I was at the, the toll gates there in Durban, just before you enter into the Durban CBD. And I saw a girl, she ran up to a truck selling mangoes, and she was hit by the truck, and she died. So maybe, I don't know, maybe 7, 8, 10 years old. And the question I had that day was, how does a sort of society allow these things to happen? What sort of structure incentivizes a society where children are forced to go and not be at school and rather sell things to engage in such conditions that put people into these situations? And that's what sort of started making me question, the South African political system and politics as a whole. That was sort of where my, political leanings came from.
Oh, okay. And so you're studying at the
At Wits.
at Wits,
I'm studying
the University of Witwatersrand.
Witwatersrand. Yes, yeah.
Yeah. What are you studying there? What are you pursuing?
I'm studying law. Law's my biggest passion. But then, I'm also doing politics, philosophy, and international relations. So I'm a very, I suppose, humanities orientated individual.
Okay.
But I think that's what we really need right now.
Sure.
Marx said the job of philosophers has been too long to analyze the world. Now is the time to change it. And I think currently, with how much is changing,
Yeah.
we need some time to sit and analyze and look at things and look at how we're going to understand things.
Yeah.
And I think that's where my political orientation and my work is leading.
And how old are you?
I'm 18. Oh, no, not 19. 19. Sorry.
A 19 fighter.
Yeah, 19.
Okay.
Yeah, my birthday was last weekend. So yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
okay. So when are we going to, celebrate your birthday?
No, we can have it here. You can call CIC downstairs and you can celebrate. Sure.
Sure, no, don't worry, we'll do that. No, thank you very much,
Thank you so much.
Fighter
Sure.
Ewan.
Thank you so much. From today, I'm an honorary fighter.
You're not a fighter. I'm saying fighter because you have got this, fighting spirit. Not because you're privileged because of your skin color and anything
Which is
like
true,
that, but you stand up for, those who stand to be exploited, those who are on the margins of the economy, which is something very absolutely commendable. So we really appreciate your time here on the EFF podcast and your insight on a number of issues. Now I hope all the people of South Africa who are watching and the world will really appreciate your contribution to this show.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the work you've been doing as well. I've been watching these podcasts, and being educated, so it's a really useful platform.
No, thank you very much. All thanks to all the EFF podcast lovers who requested that I bring him. So, fighters, I've delivered. This is what the will of the people wanted. So, thank you very much for coming through. We really look forward to having you once again, perhaps, after the GNU. The so-called GNU after it has been constituted, but we really look forward to engaging with you some other time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So that's it, the people of South Africa, Africa, and the world. We've come to the end of today's show. Ewan Dawkins joining us, of course, giving us the picture of how the new government is going to look like. And he's a staunch, proponent of, the class struggle. The talks are ongoing, and we really hope for the best for South Africa. The EFF will always continue, will always choose the people, will always choose the side of the people. So we've come to the end of the show. We are signing out with Shona Malanga from EFF Volume 4 Jazz Hour. My name is Titus Tsungu. Until we meet again, good day.